when my son barked, "You'll either do as I say or get out of my house." I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I smiled faintly, picked up my suitcase, and walked out, leaving behind the home I had poured my life into. He expected me to fold like I had before. But this time, it was going to be different. A week later, I had 22 missed calls, and that was nowhere near the end of my plan. They were going to regret every word, every smug look. My house keys were still warm in my palm when I pushed open the front door, grocery bags digging into my wrists. The Saturday afternoon sun streamed through the living room curtains, giving everything that golden spring glow that used to warm my heart. Not today. Jason was sprawled in my leather recliner, Linda's last gift to me before cancer claimed her. His socked feet were propped up, a half-empty beer dangling from his fingers. The TV remote sat on his belly like he owned the place, which he probably believed he did. Without even glancing away from the basketball game, he said, "Grab me another beer from the fridge while you're up." I set the grocery bags down slowly, feeling the weight of milk jugs and bread. The plastic handles had left angry red grooves across my palms. "Excuse me," I asked. "You heard me," Jason replied, eyes still locked on the screen. "Corona. Not that cheap stuff you drink." Something cold coiled in my chest. I'd bought those Coronas specifically for him, spending my Social Security check on beer I wouldn't touch. "Jason, I just walked in. I need to put these groceries away." That finally got him to look at me. His face carried that all-too-familiar smirk, the one that said I was being difficult. "What's the big deal?" "You're already standing. I'm comfortable." "The big deal is, this is my house," I said evenly. Jason dropped his feet to the floor with a thud. He stood slow and deliberate, using his size to loom over me. At 30, he was taller and broader than me, but I'd been dealing with bull-headed men long before he was born. "Your house funny. Amanda and I live here. We pay the bills with my money." He stepped in closer, beer still in hand. "Look, Dad, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You want to keep living here peacefully? You play along. Simple as that." The kitchen door swung open, and Amanda appeared, blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dish towel in hand. She took in the scene, Jason standing over me, the air thick enough to choke on. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice carrying that edge I recognized from her colder moments. "Your father's being difficult," Jason said without looking away from me. "I asked him to get me a beer, and he's making a federal case out of it." Amanda looked at me like I was a stubborn child. "Ed, just get him the beer. It's not worth arguing over." But Jason wasn't done. He stepped even closer, his breath carrying the sharp tang of alcohol. "See, here's how it's going to work. You live in our house, you contribute. That means when I tell you to do something, you do it. No questions, no attitude. Our house." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "That's right," Amanda chimed in, moving to stand beside her husband, making it clear they were united. "Dad, you need to decide right now. Either you do what Jason asks, or you can pack up and leave." The words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at my son, searching for a trace of the boy who once clung to my side at the county fair, scared of the Ferris wheel. All I saw was the same entitled expression his wife wore. "All right," I said quietly. Jason smirked, thinking he'd won. "Good. Now about that beer I'll pack." The smirk vanished. Amanda's jaw dropped slightly, as though she'd been certain I would back down. She slunk toward the kitchen like she'd been scolded. I turned toward the hallway, leaving the grocery bags untouched. Behind me, I heard Jason suck in a sharp breath. Amanda's voice dropped to a whisper. "Ed, wait." But I was already walking to my bedroom, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floors Linda and I had refinished together 2 decades earlier. The suitcase came down from the closet shelf with a dull thump. I'd bought it for our honeymoon to Yellowstone back when Linda was alive, and the road ahead seemed endless. Now it gaped open on the bed, ready to swallow the remnants of my life in this house. I packed with care underwear, socks, 3 changes of clothes. Not everything just enough. From the living room came hushed, urgent voices, Jason's rising, Amanda's lower and cautious. They were plotting how to handle the old man's unexpected rebellion. My hands moved on autopilot, folding shirts, rolling ties. I tucked Linda's photo into a side pocket wrapped in tissue paper. My medications, my reading glasses, my small leather journal where I tracked expenses followed. When I rolled the suitcase into the hallway, their whispers cut off. Jason sat upright now, eyes alert, Amanda leaning in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, trying to mask her unease. Neither of them said goodbye. Jason had settled back into the recliner, but his whole demeanor had shifted, shoulders, squared eyes sharp like a man waiting for the next move in a chess game. Amanda stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded across her chest, trying to project authority, but not quite hiding the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Neither one of them offered a word as I walked out. The Buick fired up on the first turn of the key, reliable as it had been since the day I drove it off the lot. I backed out without so much as a glance toward the house, not caring whether they were peering out the window. The 30-minute drive to the Pine Lodge Motel gave my mind room to wander. The memories came in waves as I rolled past familiar streets in downtown Greenville. Amanda's college tuition, $40,000 a year for the private university she swore she needed to attend. I'd put in endless overtime at the bank, juggling extra clients, staying late to comb through loan files until my eyes burned. My knuckles still remembered the ache from those years of extra work. Their wedding, $25,000. Jason's side couldn't cover their share, so I quietly picked up the tab. No speeches about sacrifice, just making sure Amanda had the reception hall, the floral arrangements, and the dress she'd dreamed about. And then came the house, $80,000 out of my retirement account for their down payment, because young couples need a hand getting started. I told myself that's what a father was supposed to do. It's what Linda would have wanted. The help didn't stop there. $1 or $200 each month for the mortgage, $300 for utilities, $500 for groceries when their budget was tight. Bit by bit, my Social Security check drained straight into their household. I convinced myself it was love, not obligation. The Pine Lodge sat on the edge of town, a low, aging building with peeling paint and a flickering neon vacancy sign. My room was small, but spotless. One bed, a single chair, a little table pushed up against the window. I set my suitcase on the rack and sat heavily on the bed. The quiet here was different. Not the warm, familiar stillness of home, but the kind that reminded you this place wasn't yours. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contact list: banks, insurance companies, credit card issuers. Numbers I could dial in my sleep after 3 decades in finance. Tomorrow was Sunday, but some things could still be set in motion. I flipped open my laptop on the small table, logged into my accounts, and stared at the numbers glowing back at me. Checking, savings, retirement. A lifetime of discipline and skipped luxuries, all so I could take care of family. The blinking cursor in the search bar felt like it was daring me to take the first step. Sunday morning broke gray and cold, perfect match for my mood. I spread my documents across the table like battle maps, bank statements, insurance policies, legal papers. Everything laid out, everything in reach. The first call was to First National Bank. Even with Sunday hours, their automated lines worked just fine. After a short maze of menu options, a polite voice came on. "Good morning, Mr. Harris. How can I help you today? I need to cancel the automatic mortgage payment for 421 Oak Ridge Lane account ending in 4729. A pause, the click of keys. Sir, I see this payment has been active for 5 years. Are you certain? Completely sure. May I ask the reason? The homeowners no longer qualify for my financial support. More clicking. Understood, Mr. Harris. The payment will be stopped immediately. You'll have written confirmation within 3 business days. The next call was simpler. My auto policy with Geico had covered both of their vehicles, Jason's Silverado and Amanda's SUV, for the last 3 years. That was $280 a month for cars I never drove. I need to remove 2 vehicles from my policy, I told the agent. When would you like that to take effect today? Then came the credit cards. Amanda had been an authorized user on 3 of my accounts, Visa, MasterCard, and a Costco card, costing me $500 a month in balances I didn't create. Mr. Harris removing an authorized user will require them to apply for their own credit, the Visa rep explained. Outstanding balances remain your responsibility, but they won't be able to make new charges. I understand. Remove them immediately. With each call, I felt lighter. 3 decades in banking had taught me the rules, the loopholes, and how to wield both. Everything I did was squarely within my rights. The life insurance policy took more steps, but I started the paperwork, $100,000 that had been earmarked for Amanda. Family, I realized, meant something different now. By noon, 8 calls were complete. Mortgage halted, insurance, canceled credit cards, shut off, and every automatic transfer that had been bleeding me dry ended. All with polite voices, confirmation numbers, and no raised tones. I leaned back in the motel chair, glancing over my neatly written notes. The first blows had landed. Confirmation numbers, reference codes, effective dates, the neat little trail of my financial freedom. My phone sat silent on the table. No missed calls, no urgent messages. They had no clue yet. Probably wouldn't until the first mortgage payment failed. Once that first bill landed in their mailbox, with their names instead of mine, the shock would hit soon enough. I shut my laptop and wandered to the window. Across the parking lot, an older gentleman was loading suitcases into the back of a pickup, while his wife orchestrated the process with the kind of quiet teamwork that comes from decades together. Maybe they were heading home from visiting family, or finally taking that long-delayed vacation. I envied that rhythm, that effortless partnership. Linda and I used to move like that, wordless in sync. My phone buzzed on the table, showing an unknown number. I let it ring out. The week passed quietly for me, but I knew it wasn't the same for them. I settled into a routine at the Pine Lodge coffee, from the lobby breakfast at the little diner 2 blocks over, and long walks through Greenville's quieter neighborhoods. Meanwhile, my phone gathered missed calls like unwanted souvenirs. By Wednesday, there were 12 messages. By Friday, 22. I listened to them in order, hearing the progression: confusion, irritation, then panic. The first few were casual Amanda, asking if maybe there'd been a bank glitch with the mortgage. Jason leaving clipped messages about his car insurance lapsing. But by midweek, the edge in their voices sharpened into fear. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" Amanda's voice cracked. "The bank says you stopped the automatic payment. They want the full amount by Friday, or they'll start foreclosure." Jason's tone grew more hostile. "Ed, you need to fix this right now. I've got people asking me about my insurance. You're making us look like deadbeats." By the end of the week, the calls were practically begging Amanda, crying, promising they could work something out if I just called back. Jason even tried softening his voice, claiming he'd been too harsh and wanted to make it right. I deleted each message after listening, feeling nothing more than mild curiosity at their unraveling. Thursday morning came with a knock at my motel door. Through the peephole, I saw both of them. Amanda in a wrinkled sweater, Jason in his work shirt, both looking like they'd been awake half the night. I opened the door, but didn't step aside. "Dad." Amanda's eyes were red-rimmed, her usual polished demeanor cracked. "We need to talk." Jason cut in his face, flushed with anger. "About what I asked?" About the fact you're trying to ruin our lives over some stupid argument about beer. I'm not trying to ruin anything, I replied evenly. I'm simply no longer paying for your lives. The mortgage, Dad. Jason's voice rose. You can't just stop paying the mortgage. That's our house. Actually, it's my house. My name on the deed. My signature on the loan. You two were just guests. Amanda grabbed Jason's arm as he stepped closer. Dad, please, we can work this out. Jason was wrong to talk to you that way, we both were. But you can't just leave us with no warning, no conversation. You gave me an ultimatum, I reminded her. Do what Jason says, or get out. Those were your exact words. I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did. I said, looking at her and seeing a stranger where my daughter-in-law's face should have been. You meant every word, you just didn't expect me to choose option 2. Jason tried to shift tactics, his voice adopting a forced calm. Look, we all said things we didn't mean. But you're talking about our home, our credit, our entire lives. You can't just pull the rug out from under us. I can, I said, and I did. I began closing the door. You wanted me to leave? I left. You wanted to handle your own lives. Now you can. Dad, wait. Amanda's voice cracked again. What about family? What about everything we've been through together? I paused, studying her face. For just a second, I saw a flicker of something familiar, like when she used to stop by with fresh-baked cookies for me after Linda passed. But that kindness had long since been replaced by a loyalty to Jason that let her watch him humiliate me in my own living room. Family works both ways, sweetheart, I said quietly. I spent 5 years taking care of you both. When it was time for you to take care of me, you chose him instead. Jason's fake composure cracked. You crazy old bastard, you can't just... I can call the police if you keep raising your voice, I interrupted. This is private property and you're disturbing the peace. They stood there probably seeing me for who I really was for the first time in years. Not the soft-hearted dad they could lean on, not a walking ATM, but a man who'd finally learned to say no. Jason grabbed Amanda's elbow. Come on, we'll figure this out ourselves. They headed back toward their car, Jason's usual swagger replaced with a hunched, uneasy walk. Amanda glanced over her shoulder as if she were looking at a stranger. I watched them drive off, then shut the door and went back to my laptop. There were still more calls to make, more accounts to close. Cutting the financial cord was far from over. What I needed now was coffee and a clear head. The diner on Main Street had always been my refuge back when Linda was alive. She'd meet me there after her doctor visits, and we'd split a slice of apple pie while talking about nothing important. Tuesday morning, I walked the familiar 3 blocks, my breath visible in the crisp mountain air. The familiarity grounded me after yesterday's standoff. That morning, I'd organized my paperwork again, bank statements, confirmation numbers, spread out like maps before a battle. The diner's bell chimed as I stepped inside. The comforting mix of coffee steam and bacon grease wrapped around me like an old sweater. I had just settled into my usual corner booth when a familiar voice called out, Ed Harris. Well, I'll be damned. Robert Bob Hayes rose from a table by the window, newspaper tucked under his arm. We'd worked together at First National Bank for 15 years before he transferred to the main branch. Bob had handled the big commercial loans. I'd managed personal accounts. Plenty of coffee breaks together over the years had made us friends. Bob, I said, standing to shake his hand. Good to see you. Mind if I join you? Haven't seen you since Linda's service. Without waiting for an answer, he slid into the booth across from me. Heard you moved out to Pine Lodge. Everything all right? The waitress brought coffee before I could respond. I took the pause to decide how much to share. Bob was a good man, but he was also a banker. Family situation, I said finally. Needed some space to think things through. Bob nodded slowly, studying my face. That son of yours tried to pull a fast one on us a few months back. My cup froze halfway to my lips. What kind of fast one tried to take out a home equity loan on your place? $50,000. Claimed it was his property. Came in with paperwork and everything. The hum of the diner faded into the background. My house. That's right. Brought in documents that looked legit at first glance, but when we ran the title search, Bob shook his head. All came back to you. Clean title, no co-signers, no liens, nothing that would give him a claim. I set my cup down, carefully processing. When was this? December? Maybe January? I handled it personally because of the amount. Bob leaned in, lowering his voice. Ed, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate fraud. The documents were forged. A cold realization hit me 3 months ago. Jason had already been plotting to steal from me. This wasn't about our recent fallout. This had been in motion long before. Did you report it? I asked. We denied the loan and flagged his info in our system. Technically, since no money changed hands, it's a gray area legally. But I kept copies of everything. You're telling me you really didn't know? He asked, reading the shock on my face. I shook my head, thinking about all the mortgage payments I'd made for them, all the nights Jason griped about being broke while secretly planning to rip me off. What would he even use the money for? Bob glanced around, then leaned closer. According to the paperwork, home improvements. But word around town is Jason's in deep with gambling debts. Pretty heavy ones. How heavy? James Morrison might know more. You remember Detective Morrison? He mentioned Jason's a regular at Glacier Peaks Casino. I did remember James. We'd served together on the church building committee, and his daughter had been in Amanda's graduating class. If James said Jason was gambling, it was as good as fact. Bob, I appreciate you telling me this, I said, pulling out my wallet to pay for the coffee I'd barely touched. Be careful, Ed. A man willing to forge documents to rob his own family might do worse when he's desperate. I walked back to Pine Lodge with my thoughts racing. Suddenly, Jason's beer-demanding attitude and open disrespect made perfect sense. To him, I'd never been his father. I was a mark, a steady cash source for his habit. The ultimatum he gave me hadn't been about control. It was about keeping the pipeline open. Back in my motel room, I opened my laptop and started a new document. Jason Harris. Evidence. Bob's news was just the tip of the iceberg. If Jason had lied about this, what else had he been hiding? The courthouse closed at 5. That gave me 1 hour to file the paperwork that would change everything. After lunch, I drove straight from the diner to the Greenville County Courthouse, a tall, weathered brick building that had once felt intimidating to me as a young man, but today felt like an ally. The clerk's office was on the 2nd floor, staffed by a middle-aged woman who processed my eviction notice with calm precision. Mr. Harris, you understand this is your son's residence? She looked over the property deed I'd handed her, comparing it to the eviction documents. It's my property. The occupants have violated the terms of their stay. And what terms are those? I'd come prepared for that question. A verbal agreement requiring mutual respect and contributing toward household expenses. Both have been broken. She stamped the paperwork with practiced authority. 30-day notice period begins today. If they contest it, we'll schedule a hearing. Otherwise, the sheriff will serve the final papers after the deadline. How long before they get this? I asked. The sheriff's department handles service of process, usually within 48 hours. I thanked her and took my copies, feeling the solid weight of legal authority on my side now. No more manipulation, no more emotional guilt-tripping. From here on out, everything was going through proper channels. Next stop, the police station. Detective James Morrison's office was tucked into a back corner of the building, a cramped space dominated by overstuffed filing cabinets and coffee-stained paperwork. James looked older than when I'd last seen him, more gray hair, deeper lines around the eyes, but his handshake was still firm. "Ed, what brings you down here? Looking for some information? Bob Hayes mentioned you might know something about Jason Harris's gambling habits." His expression sharpened to professional interest. "Your son. What's the backstory here?" I gave him the short version, the ultimatum, my leaving, and then finding out Jason had tried to fraudulently take a loan against my house. James listened without interrupting, jotting a few notes. "Jason's well known at Glacier Peaks Casino," he said when I finished. "Mostly at the poker tables. Staff says he's been there more often lately, higher stakes too." "How much are we talking?" "Different creditors, different amounts. We've had calls about collection issues, nothing criminal yet, but it's headed there. I'd put it around 18 to 20 grand total." The number hit me like a slap. My son had been living under my roof, eating my food, demanding my respect, while burning through enough money to buy a good car. Who does he owe? Some legit lenders. Others, less reputable. The legit ones are losing patience. The rest, let's just say they handle collections in their own way. What's the timeline? He's been stalling for 6 weeks. Most creditors give about 3 months before they escalate. Jason's about out of road. I left the station with a much clearer picture. The gambling explained everything. His desperation, his attempt to mortgage my house behind my back, and his sudden aggression toward me. I wasn't just a convenient source of cash. I was his only hope to dodge serious trouble. That evening, I sat in my motel room going over the day's progress eviction notice filed and ready for service confirmation of Jason's debts and fraudulent behavior, and a growing list of people in my corner who knew the truth. I opened my laptop and updated my evidence file, adding James Morrison's notes to Bob Hayes' revelations. My years in banking had taught me how to recognize patterns, and this one was clear. Jason wasn't just disrespectful. He was desperate, dishonest, and dangerous. The more pressure he felt, the more reckless he'd get. Tomorrow I'd start calling his creditors not to pay them, but to make sure they understood his true situation and that he had no legal claim to my property. Truth was the sharpest weapon I had. In a town like Greenville, word traveled fast. By Friday, I decided it was time to guide the narrative myself. My first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Helen Henderson from the church's mailing committee cornered me by the stamp machine. She was the type who collected information the way other folks collected recipes, always ready to share what she'd learned. "Ed, dear, I've been hearing troubling things about family issues. Is everything all right?" I chose my words carefully. Anything I said would make it to at least a dozen ears by Sunday. Jason and Amanda asked me to move out, so I did. Sometimes adult kids need to learn how to handle their own responsibilities. Her eyebrows shot up. "They asked you to leave your own house, but didn't you pay for their wedding and help them with the down payment?" She lowered her voice like she was slipping me a secret. "I always wondered how they managed that house on Jason's paycheck." I just nodded. The facts would speak for themselves soon enough. My next stop was Kowalski's Hardware, where I'd worked part-time after retiring from the bank. Tom Kowalski looked up from his inventory sheets, concern etched across his face. "Ed, I heard you're staying out at Pine Lodge. What's going on?" 3 employees gathered as I laid out the basics. The reaction was immediate shock at Jason's treatment of me, and anger that I'd been bankrolling them for years without acknowledgement. "You paid for their college tuition." Dave, the assistant manager, shook his head in disbelief. "Jason's been telling everyone his family was well off, that they were helping you with the mortgage." "Jason said a lot of things that weren't true," I replied evenly. Tom's expression darkened. "That explains why he always seemed to have money, but never worked extra hours. We offered him plenty of shifts. Probably spent that time at the casino," Sarah from the paint counter muttered. By the time I left, I knew the truth would be circulating around town within hours. Small-town word of mouth worked faster than any ad campaign. My third stop was St. Mark's Lutheran Church, where Pastor Michael Williams was prepping for the weekend service. He welcomed me into his office, offering me coffee and a chair that had seen its share of heavy conversations. "Ed, several people have told me they're worried about you." "Can you help me understand what's happening?" Pastor Michael Williams asked. I appreciated his straightforward manner. He wasn't fishing for gossip. He was genuinely trying to help a member of his congregation. "Pastor," I began, "I've been financially supporting my son and daughter-in-law for 5 years. Last weekend, they made it clear my staying in the house depended on me following Jason's orders. I chose to leave rather than accept that arrangement. That must have been incredibly painful." "It was clarifying," I said honestly. "I love my son, but I won't be treated like a servant in my own home." Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their own choices. Sounds like you've been shielding them from those consequences for a long time." "Too long," I admitted. On my walk back to the motel, I stopped at Annie's coffee shop for an afternoon cup. The place buzzed with the usual Friday crowd: retirees, off-duty workers, mothers, pushing strollers. I settled into a small corner table and let the chatter wash over me. Jason Harris owes money all over town. Ed Harris has been paying their bills for years. Always wondered how they lived so comfortably on his salary. The rumors were spreading exactly as I'd expected. Small towns worked like living organisms. They sifted truth from fiction with remarkable efficiency. As I was leaving, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Carol Patterson, my next-door neighbor of 20 years. "Ed, I hope you don't mind me calling. I just wanted you to know there's been a lot of shouting at the house lately, mostly Jason, but Amanda too. Yesterday, the police drove by twice. Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Patterson. I appreciate you keeping an eye on things. Are you safe where you're staying? Do you need anything?" Her genuine concern reminded me how many forms community support could take. "I'm fine, thank you. Just taking things one day at a time." That evening, I sat in my motel room, replaying the day's conversations. The social pressure was building on its own. I didn't have to push; people could see the injustice for themselves. Then my phone rang again, an unknown number. But I recognized the area code. Probably one of Jason's creditors. I let it go to voicemail and then listened. "This is Marcus Webb from Frontier Financial Services. We're looking for Jason Harris regarding a past due account. Please call us at your earliest convenience." So Jason had likely listed my address on credit applications. More proof of his deception. More evidence he'd been planning to saddle me with his debts. I deleted the message and opened my laptop to add today's findings to my evidence file. I should have known they'd try to hit back. Jason was never one to go down quietly. Saturday morning started calm enough. I was going over bank statements with my coffee when the calls started coming in. First Tom Kowalski from the hardware store, then Mrs. Helen Henderson, then Pastor Williams. Each one had the same warning: Jason was making the rounds in town, spinning a different version of events. "Ed, you need to know what he's saying." Tom told me, his voice tight with frustration. "He came in here about an hour ago, loud as anything, telling folks you abandoned them without warning. Says you promised to take care of them for life, and then changed your mind out of spite." "What exactly did he say?" I asked. "That you're having some kind of mental breakdown. That you threw them out because Amanda wouldn't let you control every decision in their lives." Tom hesitated. "And he's claiming there's some kind of family medical emergency that needs money, and you're refusing to help." I thanked Tom and hung up, already piecing together what this meant. Jason's desperation to manage public perception meant his creditors were closing in. The next call confirmed it. "Mr. Harris, this is Detective James Morrison. Just giving you a heads up, Jason was here this morning filing a complaint for elder abuse. Claims you're being manipulated by someone at the bank into making bad financial decisions." "Elder abuse," I repeated flatly. Total nonsense, of course. But he's trying to create a record of supposed mental incompetence. I told him we'd need medical proof and witness statements, which he obviously can't provide. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. Amanda's number. "Dad, please pick up," she began, her voice thick with tears. "I know you're angry, but there are things you don't understand. I'm pregnant, Dad. The stress from all this is making me sick. The doctor says if things don't calm down, I could lose the baby." A familiar pang hit my chest, the same protective instinct that had made me easy to manipulate for years. But something in her delivery felt rehearsed, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. "Congratulations on the pregnancy, sweetheart. When did you find out? Last week?" Right before everything fell apart, she said, her voice breaking just enough to sound believable. "Dad, I can't lose my baby because of money problems. You always said family comes first. Family does come first. That's why I spent $60,000 on your education and $25,000 on your wedding. But what about now? What about your child?" The question hung there between us. If she truly was pregnant, and if there really was a medical emergency, my choices could have unintended consequences. But the timing felt too perfect, and the delivery too practiced. "Amanda, have you seen a doctor about these pregnancy complications?" A pause. "I have an appointment next week." "Which doctor?" "Dr. Richards at the women's clinic." I knew Dr. Richards. Linda had trusted her for years. "I'll call her office to see how I can help with the medical expenses." "Dad, you don't need to call. If there's a genuine medical emergency involving my grandchild, I want to help. Dr. Richards will know the best way to handle things." Amanda's tone sharpened. "You can't just call my doctor. That's private information." "You're right. You can have her call me directly to discuss payment options." The call ended abruptly. About an hour later, I was walking downtown when I spotted Jason outside the First National Bank, speaking loudly enough for half the street to hear. His voice carried that aggressive edge I knew too well. "He's lost his mind," Jason was telling a small group of customers. "Senile old man thinks everyone's out to steal from him. Kicked his own pregnant daughter out over nothing." I approached calmly. The crowd noticed me before Jason did, and I saw their expressions shift as they realized the subject of his rant was standing right there. Jason turned, his face reddening. "There he is, the man who abandoned his own family." "Hello, Jason," I said evenly. "How's the gambling debt situation working out?" The question hit him like a slap. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as pieces started falling into place. "You're crazy," Jason stammered. "I don't know what you're talking about. $18,000 according to Detective Morrison. Glacier Peaks Casino, mostly poker tables." I glanced around at the gathering onlookers. Amazing how much money someone can blow when they're not paying their own bills. Jason's face darkened from red to purple. He stepped closer, trying to use his size as intimidation. "You senile old bastard. You can't just, I can document every dollar I've spent supporting you for 5 years." I cut in. "Can you document where your paychecks went?" The crowd was silent now, listening. Jason realized he'd lost control of the story. "Come on," he muttered, shoving past people. "This isn't over, Ed." I watched him storm away, noticing a few folks pulling out their phones. The truth would be all over social media before the hour was up. Back at the motel, I opened my laptop and typed up the day's events. Jason's smear campaign was crumbling because it was built on lies, and lies can't survive in daylight. The community knew my reputation too well to believe talk of senility or vindictiveness. Still, the pregnancy claim bothered me. If Amanda really was expecting, the stakes had changed. I needed proof before moving forward. I called Dr. Richards' office. If there was a real medical issue, I would help, but I wasn't going to be played by a fabricated crisis. Jason's public outburst had crossed the line. Back in my room, I picked up the phone and called Detective James Morrison. James, we need to talk. Jason's behavior today shows a pattern of escalation that worries me. How so? He confronted me in public, made threatening gestures in front of witnesses, and his whole demeanor screamed that he's losing control. I glanced out my motel window toward downtown. I'd like to file a formal complaint and explore protection options. Come in tomorrow morning. Bring any documentation you have. But I didn't have to wait until morning. Steve Brennan, the night manager at Pine Lodge, knocked on my door an hour later. Mr. Harris, that man who was yelling in the parking lot earlier, he came back about 20 minutes ago. He stood outside your door for maybe 5 minutes, then left. Made a couple of guests uneasy, Steve Brennan told me. A retired Army sergeant, Steve had seen enough bad situations brewing to recognize trouble when it was coming. Did he say anything specific, I asked. Muttered something about teaching old fools lessons. I've got it on the security cameras if you want it. Security footage, hard evidence of Jason's threatening behavior on private property. Steve, would you be willing to hand that over to the police? Absolutely. A guy like that shouldn't be out here intimidating senior residents. The next morning, I was at the police station with Steve's USB drive and a written timeline documenting Jason's escalating behavior. Detective James Morrison went through everything with careful precision. Ed, this is a clear pattern of intimidation, he said. Along with what I saw yesterday at the bank, we've got enough for a restraining order. What does that involve, I asked. Legally prohibits Jason from coming within 500 feet of you or your property. If he violates it, he's arrested on the spot. James leaned back in his chair. There's something else you should know. He met with a lawyer on Friday to ask about adverse possession laws. The words hit like ice water. Squatters' rights? Exactly. He was trying to find out if he could claim ownership of your home just by living there continuously. Montana requires 5 years of hostile occupation. He's been there 3. My guess, he was going to bide his time for another 2 years and then file. I was staggered. Jason hadn't just been freeloading. He'd been running a long-term con to take my house through a legal loophole. Does he have any valid claim? Not a chance. Adverse possession only applies without the owner's permission. You let him stay there, and he's never paid rent or property taxes. There's no legal basis. But it does show premeditation. He's been planning this for years. What about the restraining order? I can fast-track it with the evidence you've brought. You'll have it in hand this afternoon. I left the station with a much sharper picture of my son's character. That beer incident months ago hadn't been about respect. It was about protecting a scheme that would end with him stealing my home. Back in my car, I pulled up my contacts. Time to make some strategic calls. The first was to Marcus Webb at Frontier Financial Services, one of Jason's creditors who'd been leaving messages. Mr. Webb, I'm returning your call about Jason Harris. Just to clarify, he no longer lives at my address and has no legal claim to my property. He's been using my address on his credit applications. He was a guest in my home, and I evicted him last week. If you're trying to find him, he's working at Mountain View Auto Dealership on Highway 93. The second call was to Continental Credit Recovery. This is Edward Harris. You've been calling about Jason Harris's debts. Just so we're clear, he has no ownership interest in my property and doesn't live there anymore. Each call was short and factual. I wasn't paying a cent toward Jason's debts or giving out personal details, just correcting the false information he was using to dodge his creditors. By noon, I'd spoken to 6 different collection agencies. Jason's carefully stacked house of cards was about to come crashing down. That afternoon, Judge Morrison signed my restraining order. Jason Harris was now legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. Violated, and he'd be arrested on the spot. Driving back to Pine Lodge, I felt a deep satisfaction. Justice applied the right way. Jason had spent 3 years setting up a plan to take my home. Now he couldn't even legally walk up the driveway. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, old man." I forwarded it straight to Detective Morrison and then blocked the number. Evidence gathering had become second nature to me now. Monday morning, I filed the restraining order paperwork. By lunchtime, I was watching Jason's world unravel from multiple angles. The courthouse clerk stamped the final copy with brisk efficiency. "Mr. Harris, this order takes effect immediately. Any contact or approach within 500 feet is a violation." I thanked her and walked to my car, knowing a sheriff's deputy would be handing Jason the papers within hours. My phone was already ringing. "Ed, this is Mike Brennan from Mountain View Auto." Mike was Jason's boss, a straight-shooting businessman who'd built his dealership on trust and a good name. "I need to ask you something directly. Are the things Jason's been saying about you true?" "What's he been saying?" "That you had some kind of breakdown and threw him out because of dementia. And that there's a family medical emergency you're refusing to help with." Mike's voice carried a note of skepticism. "Thing is, Ed, I've known you for 20 years. This doesn't sound like the same man who co-signed my son's first car loan." Mike Jason gave me an ultimatum: follow his orders or leave my own home. I chose to leave. There's no medical emergency, and my mind's as sharp as my banker, my lawyer, and Detective Morrison can all confirm. A long pause. I was afraid of that. "Ed, I've had 3 customers today mention Jason owing them money. One recognized him from the casino. This is bad for business. I'm going to have to let him go. Can't have that kind of baggage around customers who are making big purchases." 20 minutes later, I was having coffee at Annie's when I saw the first debt collector's van pull up in front of my old house, Continental Credit Recovery, printed right on the door. I'd already spoken to them Friday about Jason's false address. My phone rang Amanda's number. "Dad, there are men at the house asking about Jason's debts. They want to know about our assets, our income, everything." Her voice trembled with genuine panic now. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth, that Jason doesn't own this place and doesn't live here anymore. But they're talking about garnishing wages, seizing assets." "Dad, I don't understand any of this." "Sweetheart, that's what happens when someone borrows money they can't pay back. Those are Jason's choices catching up with him, not mine. He owes $18,000. How is that possible?" So she really hadn't known the full extent. "Gambling debts, Glacier Peaks Casino, according to Detective Morrison." There was silence, then Amanda spoke quietly. "He told me he was working overtime those nights. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. And the sheriff's deputy was here too, served Jason some kind of legal papers. He's been ranting and throwing things ever since." "The restraining order," I said. Jason was likely just realizing his options had shrunk to nothing. "Dad, he's talking about leaving town. Says there's nothing left for him here." Her voice cracked. "What am I supposed to do? Make decisions based on who Jason really is, not who you hoped he was." That evening, I parked across from my old house and watched the chaos unfold. 3 different creditor vehicles had shown up over the course of the day. Mrs. Carol Patterson next door gave me a sad wave. She'd been keeping tabs like a concerned neighbor. Through the living room window, I could see Jason and Amanda arguing, his gestures sharp and aggressive, hers defensive and weary. The picture-perfect marriage that had been propped up by my bank account was crumbling under the weight of reality. My phone buzzed a text from Steve Brennan at Pine Lodge. That guy tried to get in the building again. I told him about the restraining order. He left, but he was really angry. I forwarded it straight to Detective Morrison. Jason was violating the order within hours of being served. His desperation was pushing him toward recklessness, which made him dangerous, but also predictable. A man with gambling debts, no job, and legal trouble has only a few options: face it like an adult or run. Based on everything I'd learned about Jason, running seemed the most likely. Driving back to Pine Lodge, I thought about what that would mean for Amanda. Would she follow him out of loyalty to a man who had lied to her for years? Or would she finally see the truth and make a different choice? Either way, the consequences were theirs. I'd spent 5 years shielding them from reality. That ended the day they told me to choose between my dignity and their demands. I chose dignity. Now, they could decide their own path. 2 days of watching their desperation was enough. On Wednesday morning, I called Amanda and told her to meet me at the diner. "Just you," I said. "I can't leave Jason alone right now, Dad." "He's really struggling with everything that's going on," she said. "Then we have nothing to discuss. The restraining order means I can't be around him anyway." A long pause. "Where do you want to meet?" she finally asked. "Main Street Diner, 2 o'clock. Back corner booth somewhere we can talk without distractions." I got there early and chose a seat facing away from the street. I wanted this meeting to be about the conversation itself, not either of us glancing nervously at passing cars. When Amanda walked in, she looked older than her 30 years, stress lines around her eyes, fingers fidgeting with her purse strap. She slid into the seat across from me and jumped right in. "Dad, I know you're angry, but Jason's lost his job and the debt collectors won't stop. The phone rings all day. People keep coming to the door demanding money we just don't have." I let her finish, then spoke calmly. "I'm offering you one chance to end this with some dignity, Amanda." "What do you mean, public acknowledgement of the truth?" "Complete transparency about how much I've supported you both and an honest explanation for why I left." Her face flushed. "You want me to humiliate myself in front of the whole town. I want you to tell the truth." That's not the same thing. What kind of acknowledgement? I'd spent the last 2 days mapping out exactly what justice would require. You speak during Sunday testimony at church. You send a letter to the Tribune editor. You make a Facebook post visible to all our mutual contacts. And you include everything: college tuition, wedding expenses, mortgage payments, and the ultimatum that drove me out of my own house. Dad, people will think. They'll think you had a father who loved you enough to sacrifice his retirement for your happiness, and that you took it for granted until it was gone. Amanda stared at her untouched coffee. "What about Jason? Jason is no longer part of anything involving me. The restraining order stays in place. If you stay married to him, that's your choice. But it means choosing him over any relationship with me. You're asking me to choose between my husband and my father. I'm asking you to choose between a man who threatened me and the man who raised you. The fact that you see those as equal says a lot about how far apart we've grown." She was quiet for a long moment. "What about the house?" "It's been in the family for generations. It's already committed to the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative. 3 veteran families will live there, people who understand service and sacrifice." The words hit her like a physical blow. "The will's already changed, signed, witnessed, and filed with my attorney." I added, my voice steady but not unkind. "Even if you did everything I asked, the house won't come back to you. That decision is final." Why? Because I need to know that any reconciliation is built on love, not the hope of an inheritance. For 5 years, you treated me like an open checkbook. I need to see if there's anything left between us that's not about money. Her eyes welled with tears, real ones this time, not the manipulative kind I'd grown used to. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I never meant for things to go this far." "Sorry isn't enough anymore, Amanda. The whole town saw you and Jason treat me like a servant in my own home. They saw you take his side over my dignity. Words won't fix that now. I need to see action. What if I can't? What if I can't stand up there and admit how wrong we were? then you'll live with the consequences of that choice. Jason will probably run to avoid his creditors. Men like him always do. You can go with him and start over, or you can stay and rebuild your life on honesty. And if I do what you're asking, then maybe over time we can build a real relationship, not one based on guilt, obligation, or money, but on mutual respect. Amanda dabbed her eyes with a napkin. How long do I have to decide Sunday morning? Church starts at 10. If you're not there to tell the truth, I'll know where you stand. She rose slowly, looking more fragile than when she'd arrived. Dad, do you think you could ever forgive me? I looked at her, really looked, and caught a glimpse of the young woman who once braided dandelions into crowns and begged for bedtime stories about brave princesses. Forgiveness and trust are different things, Amanda. I forgave you the day I chose to walk away instead of fight. But trust that has to be earned back one honest act at a time. She nodded, shoulders slumped under the weight of the decision ahead, and walked toward the door. I sat there watching her drive off. Sunday was 4 days away. By then I would know whether my daughter-in-law had the courage to choose truth over convenience, responsibility over blind loyalty to someone who had never earned it. Sunday morning came crisp and clear. I walked into St. Mark's, wondering if Amanda would truly stand up and tell the truth. The sanctuary was more crowded than usual. Word had gotten around that there would be some kind of public family announcement. I took my usual pew 3 rows from the front and waited. Pastor Williams opened the service with familiar hymns and scripture readings, but the air was thick with anticipation. When it came time for testimony, Amanda rose from the back row. She looked small making her way down the center aisle, but her steps were deliberate. At the podium, she gripped the edges and faced a room full of people she'd known her whole life. I need to tell you all something important about my father-in-law. She began, her voice carrying across the silent sanctuary. For the past 5 years, Edward Harris has been supporting my husband and me financially. He paid $160,000 for my college education when I could have gone to a state school. He paid $25,000 for our wedding when Jason's family couldn't cover their share. Murmurs spread across the congregation. These weren't vague claims, they were exact figures, hard sacrifices that told their own story. He gave us his family home, the one his parents left him, where he lived with my late mother-in-law for 20 years. When we fell behind on the mortgage, he paid it. When we needed groceries, utilities, car insurance, he covered it all while living on his Social Security check. Her voice grew stronger. 3 weeks ago, when my father-in-law refused to follow my husband's orders like a servant, we gave him an ultimatum: obey Jason or leave his own house. He chose to leave rather than surrender his dignity. The room was dead silent now. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of her words. I stood by and watched my husband disrespect the man who sacrificed his retirement security for our comfort. I chose loyalty to someone who threatened my father-in-law over loyalty to the man who treated me with patience and love. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice stayed steady. I'm here because he gave me one last chance to choose truth over pride. I was wrong. Jason was wrong. My father-in-law deserved gratitude and respect, and instead we gave him ultimatums and demands. She turned toward me. Dad, I'm sorry isn't enough for what we put you through. But I hope it's a start. Soft murmurs of support filled the sanctuary as Amanda returned to her seat. Pastor Williams stepped up to the podium, his own eyes wet. Sometimes the greatest courage is admitting our mistakes in public. Amanda has shown that courage today, and Ed has shown us what dignity looks like under pressure. After the service, people came to me with handshakes, hugs, and kind words. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my hand. We suspected you were helping them financially, Ed. What we didn't know was how they repaid your kindness. Tom Kowalski clapped me on the shoulder. What you did took real backbone. Setting boundaries with family is never easy. The most meaningful moment came when Amanda found me outside. The letter to the Tribune will run Wednesday. The Facebook post goes up tonight. She hesitated. Jason left town yesterday, packed up his truck while I was at work. No note, no forwarding address. I wasn't surprised. Men like Jason always ran when faced with real consequences. "I'm sorry your marriage ended this way," I said. "I'm not," she replied quietly. "I filed for divorce this morning, found out he'd been using my credit cards for gambling without telling me. The debt is worse than we thought." 3 months later, I stood in the yard of my former home watching 3 veteran families move into the transitional housing units the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative had built. The house had been remodeled into separate apartments, each family with private space and shared common areas. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, just back from deployment, guided her 2 kids toward the playground equipment donated by local businesses. "Mr. Harris, this means the world to us. Thank you for choosing veterans for this gift." "Veterans understand sacrifice," I said. "This home should go to people who have truly earned it." My own life had settled into a quiet rhythm at the lakeside cabin. I'd bought no more money bleeding into ungrateful hands. Morning coffee on the deck overlooking Flathead Lake. Afternoons spent fishing, evenings with a book in hand. The cabin was small, but perfect: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where I could cook real meals again, and a dock where I could launch my fishing boat. One afternoon, my phone buzzed a text from Amanda, "Dad. I'm 3 months into counseling and learning a lot about healthy relationships. Can we have coffee sometime? I want to earn back your trust, one conversation at a time." I smiled, watching an osprey circle the lake's shallows. She had kept her word about the public acknowledgments. The letter in the paper had been honest and thorough. Her Facebook post had drawn dozens of supportive comments from people who now understood the full story. Most importantly, she was owning her part in rebuilding our relationship, not expecting forgiveness as a free pass. I typed back, "Coffee sounds good." Saturday morning at the diner, her reply came instantly, "I'll be there." "And Dad, thank you for not giving up on me completely." I set the phone aside just as the osprey dove, rising from the water with a fish in its talons. Sometimes patience and dignity pay off even when the burden feels endless. The sun dipped behind the Rockies, painting the water gold and orange. In the distance, I heard the laughter of children at the Veterans Complex, families building new lives in the house where I'd learned the difference between generosity and enabling. Justice had been served. My dignity remained intact. And maybe, just maybe, a relationship worth salvaging was beginning to take root. It had been worth the wait.